The quantum resonance scanner beeped its disapproval for the third time in 10 minutes, and Dr. Elena Vasquez was beginning to suspect it had developed a personal vendetta against her morning coffee. She tapped the device with the practiced irritation of someone who had spent too many years coaxing temperamental equipment into cooperation on research stations where the nearest repair facility was 17 light-years away. "Come on, you overpriced piece of Terran engineering," she muttered, adjusting the calibration settings. "The crystalline matrix hasn't changed since yesterday." The scanner responded with what could generously be described as an electronic sigh and finally produced a stable reading. Elena made a note in her data pad that the humidity controls in Sector 7 were still malfunctioning, causing the instruments to register phantom fluctuations in the buried artifacts they'd been excavating for the past 6 months. Kepler 442b wasn't exactly the vacation destination the tourism boards would promote, if there had been tourism boards for planets where the average temperature made Antarctica look tropical and the atmospheric composition required environmental suits for anyone lacking gills. But the crystalline structures they discovered beneath the permafrost had generated enough academic excitement to justify establishing a research station on this frozen rock orbiting a distant red dwarf. Elena was reviewing the morning spectral analysis when the communication array crackled to life with an announcement that made her spill coffee across her data pad. "Research Station Alpha, this is the Etherian diplomatic vessel Starlight's Edge requesting permission to dock. We have Princess Lyralii and her daughter aboard for the scheduled oversight visit." Elena stared at the now coffee-stained screen displaying her carefully organized research notes. In her experience, when royalty showed up unannounced to inspect archaeological sites, it usually meant either political complications or budget cuts. Sometimes both. Station Commander Torres's voice echoed through the common area. "All research personnel, please prepare for diplomatic reception. Princess Lyralii will arrive in 2 hours." Elena had met Etherians before during her graduate studies, tall, elegant beings whose pointed ears and ethereal features made them look like someone had crossbred elves with fashion models. They were also notorious for their formal court protocols, which meant Elena would probably have to trade her comfortable research coveralls for something that wouldn't scandalize interspecies relations. 2 hours later, Elena stood in the station's primary docking bay wearing her least wrinkled formal uniform and trying to remember whether Etherian greeting customs involved bowing, handshaking, or the ritualistic exchange of small gifts. The airlock hissed open, and Princess Lyralii emerged with the kind of graceful movements that made ordinary mortals feel like they were constructed from spare parts and good intentions. The princess was exactly what Elena had expected, tall, regal, with long silvery hair and those distinctive pointed ears that marked her as Etherian nobility. What Elena hadn't expected was the small figure that bounced out behind her, practically vibrating with 7-year-old energy. "Mama, is this where they found the singing rocks?" The child's voice carried the musical quality typical of her species, but with an unmistakable note of excitement that transcended cultural boundaries. Princess Lyralii placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Zara, remember what we discussed about proper greetings." The little girl, Zara, performed a curtsy that was technically correct but delivered with the enthusiastic imprecision of someone who would rather be exploring than following protocol. Her ears, Elena noted with amusement, were proportionally larger than her mother's, giving her an elfin appearance that was impossibly endearing. "Dr. Vasquez," Princess Lyralii said, extending her hand in the human custom, "thank you for accommodating our visit. I trust our presence won't disrupt your research schedule too significantly." Elena shook the offered hand, relieved to skip the more complex greeting rituals. "Not at all, Your Highness. Though I should warn you, excitement levels around here usually peak when the coffee dispenser starts working properly." Zara giggled, a sound like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze. "Do humans really need that brown liquid to function? Mama says you drink it even when it tastes terrible." "Your mother is clearly a woman of wisdom and scientific observation," Elena replied solemnly. "Coffee is indeed terrible, which is why we add sugar, cream, and occasionally tears of frustration when the equipment malfunctions." The princess smiled, the first genuine expression Elena had seen from her since the formal introductions began. "Zara has been asking questions about human customs since we left the homeworld. I fear you may have volunteered yourself as a cultural ambassador. Does that mean I get diplomatic immunity when I accidentally break things? Elena asked, leading them through the station's corridors toward the excavation site. Only if you share your coffee, Zara announced with the serious tone of someone negotiating an important treaty. Elena grinned. Maybe having royalty around wouldn't be as complicated as she'd feared. After all, how much trouble could one curious 7-year-old possibly cause on a remote research station surrounded by ancient alien artifacts of unknown origin and potentially dangerous capabilities? The answer to that question, Elena would discover soon enough, was considerably more than she'd bargained for. Elena wiped the frost from her visor as the excavation team's thermal borers cut through the final layer of permafrost. After 3 weeks of Princess Lyraliai's diplomatic visit, what had started as formal oversight had evolved into something resembling a family camping trip, if camping trips involved sub-zero temperatures and the constant possibility of accidentally awakening ancient alien technology. Dr. Vasquez, are we there yet? Zara's voice crackled through the comm system with the patience level typical of 7-year-olds who had been promised something interesting would happen soon. Almost, little archaeologist, Elena replied, checking the depth readings on her scanner. Just remember, if we find anything that glows, hums, or tries to communicate telepathically, we follow protocol. Which protocol is that again? Zara asked with suspicious innocence. The one where we don't touch it until the grown-ups have argued about it for several hours and filled out the proper forms. Princess Lyraliai's amused voice joined the conversation. I believe my daughter was hoping for a more flexible interpretation of scientific methodology. The thermal borer finally broke through into empty space, and Elena's scanner immediately started registering readings that made no sense according to conventional physics. The excavation site they'd been working toward for weeks had revealed a chamber roughly the size of Elena's quarters, but what occupied that space defied easy categorization. Suspended in the center of the chamber, as if gravity had taken a coffee break, dozens of pendant-like objects hung in perfect geometric formation. Each was roughly the size of Elena's palm, crafted from what appeared to be crystallized starlight, translucent material that seemed to contain its own internal constellation of moving points of light. Mama, they're beautiful, Zara whispered, pressing against the observation barrier they'd hastily erected around the chamber entrance. Elena had to agree. The pendants rotated slowly in their invisible matrix, each one pulsing with a different rhythm, creating a light show that would have made the Aurora Borealis file a complaint for copyright infringement. More intriguing was her scanner's insistence that the objects were simultaneously there and not there, existing in a quantum state that suggested they were operating according to physics that hadn't been invented yet. Your Highness, Elena said, reviewing the initial readings, these predate anything in our archaeological record. If my calculations are correct, they're older than the earliest Etherean settlements. Princess Lyraliai studied the display with the expression of someone who had spent considerable time learning to read between the lines of official reports. That would place them beyond our recorded history as well. The implications are somewhat unsettling. Unsettling how? Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. In her experience, when ancient artifacts appeared in impossible formations displaying technology that shouldn't exist, the universe was usually preparing to make life interesting in ways that required extensive paperwork afterward. These formations, the princess said, gesturing toward the geometric pattern of suspended pendants, they match descriptions from our oldest myths. Stories we assumed were purely symbolic. Elena was about to ask for clarification when Zara solved the immediate problem by demonstrating why 7-year-olds made terrible security personnel. Before anyone could stop her, she had ducked under the observation barrier and was reaching toward the nearest pendant with the scientific curiosity that had probably gotten her species into trouble since they'd first discovered fire. Zara, no, both adults shouted simultaneously. But the little girl's fingers had already made contact with the crystalline surface, and instead of the catastrophic system failure Elena had expected, something far more interesting occurred. The pendant she touched began to glow with increased intensity, and suddenly the air above it shimmered like heat waves rising from summer pavement. A three-dimensional map materialized in the space between them, showing star systems Elena had never seen before. Constellations that didn't match any current navigation chart spread across the holographic display, with connecting lines of light indicating travel routes between worlds that might or might not actually exist. "Oh," Zara said with the calm acceptance of someone too young to understand when the universe had just turned inside out. "It's like the story cubes you gave me, Dr. Vasquez, except this one shows real places." Elena stared at the holographic star map, then at Zara, then back at the map. "Zara, sweetie, I hate to break this to you, but those aren't real places. That's a navigation chart for parts of the galaxy we haven't discovered yet." "How do you know they haven't been discovered?" Zara asked with the logical precision that made conversations with children simultaneously delightful and terrifying. Elena opened her mouth to explain the basics of galactic exploration and stellar cartography, then realized she didn't actually have a good answer. The pendant in Zara's hands was now glowing so brightly it was casting shadows on the chamber walls, and more concerning was Elena's growing certainty that she recognized some of the stellar formations displayed in the hologram. "Zara," she said carefully, "what happens when I come closer to the pendant?" The little girl looked up at Elena with those large, curious eyes. "I don't know. Try it and see." Elena stepped forward, and immediately every pendant in the chamber began to pulse in perfect synchronization. The holographic star map expanded, showing more detail, more connections between distant worlds. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Elena felt the strangest sensation that she was looking at a map leading home to places she'd never been. "Dr. Vasquez," Zara said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone making an obvious observation, "why does the pretty necklace get so bright when you're near me?" Elena's attempts to analyze the pendant using conventional scientific methods were producing results that would have made her physics professors question their life choices. For 3 days, she had subjected the artifact to every test in her considerable arsenal, and it responded to each one with what could only be described as passive-aggressive cooperation. Spectral analysis revealed that the pendant was composed of materials that technically shouldn't exist in stable form. Quantum resonance scanning indicated it was simultaneously solid in energy, matter, and thought. Most frustrating of all, it seemed to have developed opinions about her research methodology. "Look," Elena said, addressing the pendant as if it were a particularly stubborn graduate student, "I'm trying to understand how you work. The least you could do is pretend to follow basic physical laws." The pendant pulsed once, briefly, in what Elena was beginning to interpret as the crystalline equivalent of an eye roll. Zara, who had been watching Elena's one-sided conversation with the artifact from her perch on a nearby equipment crate, giggled. "Maybe it doesn't like being poked with all those machines. I wouldn't like it either." "The pendant is not capable of preferences," Elena said automatically, then immediately wondered why she felt the need to defend scientific objectivity to a 7-year-old who had already demonstrated better intuitive understanding of the artifact than Elena's instruments. "Are you sure?" Zara asked, sliding down from her perch to examine Elena's data displays. "Because every time you get frustrated, it glows brighter. And when you were telling me the story about the Earth princess who talked to animals, it made those pretty sparkly patterns." Elena paused in her calibration of the quantum field generator. Zara was right, of course. The pendant had indeed been responding to Elena's emotional state rather than her scientific instruments. When she was calm and focused, it maintained a steady, gentle luminescence. When her patience wore thin with malfunctioning equipment, its light intensified. And during the impromptu storytelling sessions that had become their evening routine, the pendant had projected holographic images that seemed to illustrate Elena's words with remarkable accuracy. "That's impossible," Elena muttered, though she was already pulling up correlation data between her biomonitor readings and the pendant's luminosity patterns. "Artifacts don't respond to narrative structure and emotional content. This one does," Zara said with the confidence of someone who had never been taught that certain things were supposed to be impossible. "Watch." She picked up the pendant, which immediately began its familiar warm glow. "Dr. Vasquez, tell me the one about the space captain who got lost in the asteroid field." Elena found herself launching into an improvised tale about a brilliant but accident-prone starship captain who had relied more on luck than navigation skills. As she spoke, the pendant projected a three-dimensional scene showing a small ship weaving between tumbling rocks, complete with what appeared to be a tiny holographic pilot who bore a suspicious resemblance to Elena herself. "See?" Zara said triumphantly. "It likes stories. Especially funny ones." Before Elena could formulate a scientifically appropriate response to this observation, the communication array announced an incoming priority transmission. Princess Lyraliai's voice carried undertones of diplomatic concern that made Elena's stomach perform uncomfortable acrobatics. "Elena, we need to discuss some recent developments. Several other Etherian noble houses have learned about our discovery, and they're sending delegations to examine the artifacts." Elena looked at the pendant in Zara's hands, which had returned to its gentle baseline glow. In her experience, when multiple political factions became interested in the same archaeological find, the situation typically evolved from academically fascinating to diplomatically catastrophic, with remarkable speed. "How many delegations are we talking about?" Elena asked, already mentally calculating how many additional environmental suits they'd need and whether the station's life support systems could handle a significant increase in population. "Four houses have confirmed arrival times within the next week. Possibly more to follow." Elena watched Zara absently stroking the pendant's surface while humming a melody that seemed to make its internal lights dance in rhythm. The child appeared completely unconcerned about the political implications of their discovery, which Elena found both enviable and slightly concerning. "Your Highness," Elena said carefully, "what exactly do these noble houses want with the artifacts?" "That depends entirely on what the artifacts actually are," Princess Lyraliai replied. "And unfortunately, that question has become considerably more complex since your interaction with them began producing unprecedented results." Elena felt the familiar weight of academic responsibility settling on her shoulders. She had spent her career studying ancient civilizations and their technologies, but she had always been an observer, an interpreter of dead cultures and defunct machines. This was the first time she had encountered artifacts that seemed to be actively responding to her presence, and the implications were both thrilling and terrifying. "Mama," Zara said, looking up from the pendant, "why are the other court families upset about the pretty necklaces? There are lots of them. Can't everyone have one?" "It's complicated, little star," Princess Lyraliai said, using the Etherian endearment that always made Zara beam. "Some things become more valuable when they're rare and special." "But these aren't rare," Zara pointed out with 7-year-old logic. "The whole room is full of them. And they only work properly when Dr. Vasquez is here anyway." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's environmental controls. Zara's innocent observation had just identified the core of what would undoubtedly become a very complicated political situation. The arrival of the Etherian noble houses transformed Research Station Alpha from a quiet archaeological outpost into what Elena privately characterized as a diplomatic minefield with better catering. 4 separate vessels had docked within 12 hours, each carrying representatives who spoke in the flowery language of interstellar politics while eyeing each other with the subtle hostility of sharks discussing territorial boundaries. Elena found herself in the unprecedented position of being simultaneously the most important person on the station and the least qualified to handle the situation. Every noble house had presented ancient claims to the artifacts, complete with genealogical charts that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a passion for making simple family trees resemble quantum physics equations. Dr. Vasquez, Lord Sylvanus of House Stardanza announced during the morning's third formal presentation, "Our records clearly indicate that these artifacts fall under the jurisdiction of the First Covenant, established 17 centuries ago." With respect, Lord Sylvanus, Duchess Aurelia of House Moonwhisper interjected with the kind of polite venom that could dissolve titanium, "The First Covenant was superseded by the Harmony Accords, which explicitly grant excavation rights to House Moonwhisper for all pre-civilization artifacts found in this sector." Elena, who had been frantically taking notes while trying to follow the increasingly complex legal arguments, raised her hand like a student requesting permission to visit the restroom. "I'm sorry. Could someone explain what exactly constitutes pre-civilization in this context? Because carbon dating suggests these artifacts are older than Etherian space travel." The sudden silence that greeted this observation was the kind usually reserved for moments when someone had accidentally declared war or mentioned embarrassing childhood nicknames at formal dinner parties. Lady Celestine of House Starfire, who had been quietly examining her manicured nails throughout the previous arguments, looked up with renewed interest. "How much older, Dr. Vasquez?" "Approximately 3,000 years before the earliest Etherian settlements in this system." The diplomatic tension in the room shifted from merely uncomfortable to actively dangerous. Elena had apparently just suggested that the artifacts predated Etherian civilization entirely, which raised uncomfortable questions about who had created them and why they were responding to a human archaeologist and a 7-year-old princess. "That's impossible," Lord Kalen of House Voidwalker stated flatly. "No civilization in this sector possessed the technology to create such sophisticated devices 3 millennia ago." "Maybe they weren't from this sector," Zara said from her corner, where she'd been quietly playing with the pendant while the adults conducted their increasingly heated discussions. Her innocent observation dropped into the diplomatic conversation like a stone into a still pond. Elena watched the holographic star map materialize above the pendant in Zara's hands, showing those impossible stellar configurations that matched no known navigation charts. The pendant's glow had intensified during the political arguments, and Elena was beginning to suspect it was responding not just to her emotional state, but to the presence of multiple Etherian nobles. "Fascinating," she murmured, pulling up her data pad to record the pendant's behavior. "The quantum resonance patterns are shifting. It's like it's trying to establish connections with multiple sources simultaneously." "What kind of connections?" Princess Lyraeli asked, though her tone suggested she might already suspect the answer. Elena approached Zara and the pendant, immediately triggering the now familiar brightening effect. But this time, something different happened. The holographic star map expanded exponentially, filling the entire conference room with three-dimensional star charts that showed not just unknown systems, but travel routes connecting them to familiar Etherian space. More intriguingly, symbols appeared along the routes, symbols that Elena couldn't read but somehow understood. They spoke of journeys between worlds, of knowledge shared between species, of bridges built across the vast distances between stars. "Dr. Vasquez," Zara said, looking up at the swirling holographic displays surrounding them, "why do the pictures look like the bedtime stories you tell me about people helping each other?" Elena stared at the symbols floating around them, then at Zara's earnest face, then at the pendant which was now glowing so brightly it was casting rainbow shadows on the walls. A wild, impossible theory was beginning to form in her mind, one that would explain the pendant's responses to her presence, its apparent ability to translate her stories into visual narratives, and most importantly, why it worked so much better when she and Zara were together. "Because," Elena said slowly, pieces of an ancient puzzle clicking into place in her mind, "I think they are stories about people helping each other. I think that's exactly what they are." Lord Sylvanus cleared his throat with the diplomatic equivalent of changing the subject before anyone said something that couldn't be unsaid. "Dr. Vasquez, regardless of the artifact's origin, the immediate concern is their disposition. Our houses require assurance that they will be properly safeguarded and studied." "Of course," Elena said absently, still watching the holographic displays dance around them. "Though I should mention that the artifacts only seem to function in my presence. And apparently work best when Zara is involved." The silence that followed this observation was pregnant with implications that Elena was only beginning to understand. She had just informed 4 competing noble houses that she had become an indispensable component in unlocking the secrets of artifacts that might rewrite galactic history. How indispensable? Duchess Aurelia asked with the kind of careful precision that suggested the answer would determine whether Elena's immediate future involved continued archaeological research or significantly more complex political arrangements. Elena looked at the pendant in Zara's hands, which pulsed once as if offering encouragement, then at the holographic star maps showing impossible journeys to unknown worlds. "Completely," she said, and braced herself for whatever came next. The breakthrough came not through advanced scientific analysis or diplomatic negotiation, but through Princess Lyraeli's ability to access the deepest archives of Etherian historical records. Elena sat in the station's main conference room, surrounded by holographic displays showing genealogical charts that stretched back millennia, while the pendant rested quietly in Zara's lap, occasionally pulsing as if offering commentary on their research. "The genetic markers are unmistakable," Princess Lyralii said, highlighting specific sequences on the display. "Dr. Vasquez, your ancestry includes survivors of the synthesis civilization, the bridge builders who mediated between species across this sector of the galaxy over 3,000 years ago." Elena stared at the data, trying to process the implications. "You're telling me I'm descended from ancient alien diplomats?" "Not alien to you," Zara said matter-of-factly, stroking the pendant which responded with a warm, approving glow. "They were your family. That's why the pretty necklace recognizes you." The four noble houses had been remarkably quiet during this revelation, though Elena suspected this had more to do with political calculation than genuine surprise. Lord Sylvanus finally broke the silence with a question that cut to the heart of their situation. "If Dr. Vasquez carries the genetic legacy of the synthesis civilization, what does that mean for the artifact's activation?" Elena picked up another pendant from the collection they'd brought to the conference room for testing. It immediately began to glow, projecting symbols that she was beginning to understand represented not words, but concepts, ideas about connection, understanding, and the building of bridges between different ways of thinking. "The pendants aren't just tools," Elena said, pieces of the puzzle finally forming a complete picture. "They're keys to a knowledge network. The synthesis civilization created them as a way to preserve and share understanding between species. They're designed to activate in the presence of their descendants because the knowledge was meant to be passed down through generations. But why do they work better when Zara is involved?" Duchess Aurelia asked, though her tone suggested she was beginning to suspect the answer. Zara looked up from the pendant with the patient expression of someone who had been waiting for the adults to catch up to what should have been obvious from the beginning. "Because I'm not afraid of them. And Dr. Vasquez tells the best stories, so the necklaces know she understands about helping people get along." Elena felt something shift in her understanding of not just the artifacts, but her own role in this discovery. The pendants weren't responding to genetic markers alone, they were responding to intent, to the desire to build connections rather than walls. Her scientific training had taught her to observe and analyze, but the artifacts required something more. The willingness to participate in the ancient mission of bridge building that her distant ancestors had begun. "The network extends across multiple star systems," Elena said, studying the holographic maps that now surrounded them. "Each pendant is a node in a communication and knowledge-sharing system that could connect dozens of civilizations. But it only activates when used by someone who genuinely wants to foster understanding between different groups." Lord Kalen leaned forward with interest that seemed both political and personal. "Are you suggesting that the artifacts could facilitate communication between our noble houses and other species?" "I'm suggesting," Elena said, watching the pendant in Zara's hands project images of different worlds working together, "that they were designed to make the kind of arguments we've been having for the past week completely unnecessary. The synthesis civilization built this network to help different groups find common ground instead of fighting over territory and resources." The pendant pulsed brighter, and Elena felt a strange sensation, as if ancient voices were whispering approval across the centuries. She was beginning to understand that her role in this discovery wasn't accidental. Her scientific background had prepared her to analyze the artifacts, but her ability to tell stories, to help others understand complex concepts through metaphor and humor, had made her a natural inheritor of the bridge builder legacy. "So what happens now?" Princess Lyralii asked, though Elena suspected the princess had already begun formulating plans that would reshape interspecies diplomacy for generations to come. Elena looked at the competing noble houses, then at Zara, who was humming softly to the pendant and making it project tiny holographic butterflies that danced through the air. The little girl had accepted the miraculous nature of their discovery with the adaptability that Elena was beginning to recognize as wisdom rather than naivety. "Now we do what the artifacts were designed for," Elena said, feeling certainty settle into her bones like coming home to a place she'd never been but always belonged. "We start building bridges. Does this mean you'll stay and help us figure out how to talk to the butterfly people from the Andromeda charts?" Zara asked, pointing to one of the holographic star systems that showed signs of active civilization. Elena grinned, realizing that her career as a solitary researcher studying dead civilizations had just transformed into something infinitely more complex and rewarding. As long as you promise to keep asking the questions that help me remember what's actually important. Deal, Zara said solemnly, then brightened. Can we start with teaching everyone how to make proper Earth coffee? Because if we're going to be diplomats, we need to make sure everyone stays awake during the important meetings. Elena laughed, and the pendant responded by projecting what appeared to be a three-dimensional recipe for the perfect cup of interstellar diplomatic fuel. Some things, apparently, were universal constants across all civilizations.